Hi, everybody. Welcome to Lesson 11 of Witchcraft Fundamentals. This lesson is on cemetery work. Yes. We get into the spooky stuff today, which is lots of fun. Um, cemeteries. Ooh. Cemetery work is not nearly as fraught with peril as it's often portrayed. Cemetery work is just magic done in and around cemeteries. Um, there's all kinds of wonderful kind of metaphysical opportunities in cemeteries for a number of reasons. Obviously, there's a lot of spirits in residence because it's a cemetery. Cemeteries are also liminal spaces. That means they are in between. They're neither here nor there. It's not fully a place of the living. It is not fully a place of the dead. It is a place here in our mundane reality that has such intimate connections with death that it's something altogether undefinable. It is a liminal space. All you need to know are a few kind of basic precautions, common sense behaviors, and working in a cemetery is just like doing any other type of working. So we're going to talk about what you need to know to work in a cemetery ethically and safely. Those are our two big caveats. We want our magic to work. We don't want to hurt ourselves or others unintentionally. And we don't want to be assholes about it. At least I don't. Okay, so step number 1, know your cemetery. The first step, obviously, in doing any kind of cemetery work is choosing a cemetery to work in. When choosing a cemetery, you have to think about certain characteristics of that cemetery. First is a purely mundane. Who owns and maintains that cemetery? Is it a religious cemetery? Is it secular? Is it privately owned? Is it publicly owned? What are the hours? What type of rules do they have about what can be left there? What can be taken? All of these types of things. There's oftentimes, like, cemeteries will have rules like you can only leave biodegradable objects, or you can sometimes only leave non-biodegradable objects. Like, some places you can have fresh flowers in a vase, but you have to come back and get rid of them, or you can leave plastic flowers that obviously don't decay. Different places will have different rules. Most of these places are going to have websites. The rules are going to be on the website, so no big deal there. But you want to think about that kind of stuff. For many, many cemeteries, particularly religiously affiliated ones, doing magic in a cemetery might be bending or even breaking some of the rules. My personal rule is I don't do cemetery work if it is a strongly religiously affiliated cemetery. If it's a super old cemetery that's attached to a church, it's been hundreds of years, meh. But, I won't go and do workings in a Jewish cemetery unless it's one of my actual relatives. And even then, feels weird. Don't do it. I don't do workings in cemeteries attached to churches for a number of reasons. But also, where I live here on the West Coast, pretty much all of our cemeteries are secular, so it doesn't come up a whole heck of a lot, with a few notable exceptions. But yeah, I tend to stick to secular. You make your choices as you will. Things like taking graveyard dirt. There are many, many wonderful things you can do with graveyard dirt. And if you're interested in that in particular, I highly, highly recommend checking out Denise Alvarado's book on cemetery work. I'll put that in the resources down at the bottom. But cemetery work, cemetery dirt is a really awesome magical device. It's a way of transferring the energy of a particular grave or cemetery, bringing it home with you, or taking it to a different place and having that direct connection to the cemetery or grave. This is something you want to remove from said cemetery discreetly. Don't go flouncing into a cemetery in full regalia, making a spectacle of yourself, getting noticed, and then getting kicked out. Every time a practitioner gets kicked out of a cemetery, they ruin it for somebody else. Don't be that guy. Be subtle. I generally go into a cemetery with things like, if you have any of those like old plastic film canisters, Altoid tins, sandwich bags, little teeny tiny jars. You have a spoon, a tiny jar. You get a spoonful of dirt. You don't need like a shovel or a trowel. Just spoon. Swiss Army knife. You don't need a lot of this stuff. But know if that kind of thing if it's something that is either not allowed or only not allowed because they don't think about somebody doing it, make sure you're discreet. The most important thing in any cemetery is maintaining an appropriate level of respect. These aren't just spirits there for the chat. These are someone's relatives. I don't care if they've been dead for 500 years. That's someone's family member. Somebody loved that person very, very deeply. And that person has now passed on from this realm. There is a certain level of respect that needs to be paid to that. If you're in a cemetery that is still active, active burials are still occurring, it'll be real obvious. Just look at the dates on the grave markers. Or notice the big mound of dirt with the tarp on it. Active burials are probably happening. I will not do workings in a cemetery while a funeral is in process. I find that to be incredibly disrespectful. I'll wait. I can come back later. It's fine. And I will not do any type of working if it is really obvious that a relative is coming and paying their respects on a regular basis. I'll find another one that's, perhaps someone who's been passed away for longer. But if there's things like fresh flowers or toys or decorations that are obviously being renewed on a gravesite, perhaps leave them alone, unless it's your blood relative, and then, you are the blood relation. You get to make those kinds of choices. But having respect for both the spirits whose doorbell is that gravesite, and the family members that may still be processing whatever is their changed relationship with the departed, that takes precedence over whatever working you need to do. You can find another way. So respect is utterly, utterly key. Metaphysical things you need to think about when you're looking at a cemetery is who is buried there? What type of people were they? How long ago was the cemetery active? Or is it still, as we mentioned? But so some cemeteries you'll go to, and they are magically awake. You'll know. If you've been doing any of the homework from the previous lessons, you will know. It's basically you walk into the cemetery and the energy is very, very palpable. It's moving, it's active. The spirits will start coming and checking you out. It's real obvious when a cemetery is super active. The cemetery I work in the most is called Lakeview Cemetery. It's up on Capitol Hill here in Seattle, and it's where all of our city founders are buried. It is an incredibly active, awake, and worked cemetery. A worked cemetery just means that practitioners are doing things in the cemetery, so it's worked. Also have to look at things like, are there metaphysical entities present in that cemetery? Some cemeteries have dryads, they have fae, some might have negative entities, and it really, really depends on what happened, who's there, what stories are associated with that cemetery. Some cemeteries will even have portals in them. There'll be places where entities move from one side of the veil to the other. And that can make them extremely active. It can also make them potentially unpredictable, which makes them a little bit more dangerous than a cemetery without portals. In general, any place with portals are more dangerous than places without portals in terms of doing magic. just because you can't necessarily tell what's on the other side of that portal that might open at any moment. So yeah, I tend to avoid places with portals, or just ward the crap out of myself. So, once you've looked at a cemetery, good candidates for workings, if you don't have a cemetery where, if you've got a relation with somebody who's buried there, if you don't know someone's there, look for places that are metaphysically active, that are preferably secular, that have reasonable visiting hours. Most cemeteries tend to be open dawn to dusk, but do check. Do go when the cemetery is open. Don't trespass. Once again, remember that. Don't ruin it for everybody else. Don't trespass. Don't ruin it for everybody else. So make sure it's a place where that you can get to. Is there public transportation? Is there parking? A lot of cemeteries, you just kind of drive in and you pull to kind of the side of the drive and just go. There's no parking lots. Unless there's a funeral home where they actually perform funerals, then there's often a parking lot. But there might be rules about when you're allowed to park there. Google it. Public places have websites these days. So, you want it to be at least moderately convenient because you're probably going to be there for a while. Look at the mundane things like, are there services nearby? If you need to have a bio break, is that an opportunity you're going to have? Some cemeteries are in the middle of suburban wilderness with nothing public around for a while, and that can be tricky. Some of them are in the middle of the city. Lakeview is right adjacent to Volunteer Park, so there's all manner of facilities right on the other side of the fence. Very, very easy to deal with. Know where you're going. Have situational awareness. It's common sense. You're going to spend some time there. Do you need to bring a sack lunch? Do you need to bring a water bottle? These are the things you have to think about. So, once you've looked at a place, you've determined it's active enough for your purposes, that it's a place where you're relatively welcome, the hours are reasonable, you're able to get there, then you can start beginning your metaphysical prep work. And mundane prep work. First thing to think about, do you have a tradition? There are a lot of traditions, particularly indigenous traditions and diaspora traditions, that have very strong rules, taboos, mores about what you can and cannot do in cemeteries and how you should go about it. You do not need to follow the rules of somebody else's tradition. That's not how magic works. However, when it comes to work in cemeteries, I recommend learning the traditions of the area in terms of cemetery work. If you're in New Orleans, you probably want to know what are the voodoo traditions involving cemetery work, because those are a lot of the practitioners around you. Here in Seattle, we don't have quite so much of that, but we do have a lot of First Nations peoples, and they have particular mores and ethics about disturbing the deceased. You don't have to follow another tradition's rules, but it's good to be aware of them. Most of them were put in place for a reason. Personally, a lot of my kind of rules, guidelines about cemetery work do come from sort of the New Orleans voodoo school of thought, but I don't follow them quite as hard and fast as someone in that tradition probably would. So, depending on who you are, what your background is, what type of traditions are common in your area, if you know there's other practitioners working a cemetery, it's in your best interest to have some awareness of what they're doing, because spirits that tend to be treated a particular way over time will come to expect similar treatment. be that positive or negative. It's in your best interest to find out, if you can. If you can't, do your best. Most spirits are very understanding about that sort of thing. But keep it in mind. So, once you've decided your place, you have some idea of kind of what sort of traditions tend to be around your area, think about what your goal is in going to the cemetery before you step foot in it. So, for example, one of my ongoing workings in Lakeview is I work with the city founders to do a citywide protection spell just to safeguard the city from major mishap. So it's the city founders. They have a vested interest in their own legacy. The city is their legacy, so they have a vested interest in protecting it. So I'm asking for a spirit to do something that they would probably do anyway. That my goal is aligned with their goals as far as I understand. Obviously, you can only know so much. So that's an example of something that is a good idea. If you know you're going to go to, say, a military veterans cemetery, if you are doing a spell to help your uncle win his case with the VA to get them to pay for medical treatment, those soldiers are going to help him out. They are soldiers. They're brothers in arms. It's in their best interest. They care. If you're going to do a healing spell and you find, you know there's a grave of a notable doctor or nurse or caregiver of some kind, that person's probably going to be willing to help you out. Maybe your goal is just, hey, I've never done workings in a cemetery. I want to go introduce myself. Great. That's totally cool. Just know that that's your goal. Cemetery work requires a little bit more preparation than other types of work, so have a goal in mind. One goal. Don't go in attempting to do a bunch of things at once, particularly if you're not already familiar with the cemetery, already familiar with cemetery workings. Choose one goal and execute it. Say thank you, make an offering, and go home. You can get into the more advanced stuff when you're ready for more advanced stuff, but start bite-size. Bite-sized things won't go wrong as badly as giant things if you make some kind of mistake. So, when you're learning, start small. Defined easily. Along those lines, and we're going to talk in a minute about kind of the procedures for entering, working, and exiting a cemetery. But once you enter a cemetery to do a working, you're not leaving that cemetery until your working is over. If you've forgotten something, there's a whole process for leaving, getting the thing, coming back, re-entering. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort, it's a huge amount of faff. You don't want to deal with that. So make sure you double check your supplies. Carry them discreetly. Wear a backpack, have your satchel, but don't go in like full Ursula the Sea Witch costume to a cemetery because you're going to stand out like a sore thumb, get kicked out, ruin it for the rest of us. Be discreet, please. Be discreet and respectful. So, sample supplies that you might need with you. Something like a water bottle or a flask. Very common offerings are going to be things like water or liquor. I have one particular grave that I visit on the regular that if I don't have whiskey with me, she won't let me find her grave marker. She'll hide, and I won't be able to find it. It's very annoying. But I've learned to always have whiskey. Have something for gathering dirt or moss or sometimes feathers. You might find things that are interesting, natural objects in cemeteries. So have a little container or some way to take it home with you. Along those lines, do not, under any circumstances, I don't care what they tell you. If you see something on a grave that has obviously been left there by someone else in honor of that person, do not disturb it. If you see stones on a grave, don't touch them. You see feathers, flasks, flowers, don't touch them. They do not belong to you. I don't care if the ghost says, you can take this with you. Don't do it. Moss, gravel, feathers that came off of birds as they flew through the cemetery, sticks from bushes, berries, sure. But if something is obviously a grave offering, respect that. Leave them alone. Other things you want to have with you. You might want a spoon or a Swiss Army knife for harvesting said dirt or moss or other things. Some kind of offering for when you enter the cemetery, for when you work graves. It's going to be things like 10 pennies, 10 dimes, pouring out water, sprinkling of bird seed, coffee, tea, tobacco, alcohol. These are all things that are very common as offerings. I tend to bring a big bag of roasted, still in the shell, unsalted peanuts to give to the crows because it's fun. I like crows. Things like that. Very, very simple things. You can have them with you. It's not weird, unless you're being weird about it. But it's something you can do pretty discreetly, and most places are not going to have a problem with it. So yeah, if you are having a particular working in mind, you might want to have something like tarot cards or a pendulum, divination tools of various kinds that help you do communication. There's a lot of things you can do in a cemetery that is super fun, cool, powerful, all kinds of things. And we'll talk about different things you can do in cemeteries in just a minute. But so have your supplies, check your list twice just like Santa Claus, be prepared, and then you can think about actually going to the cemetery. Lots of prep work. So before you enter a cemetery, you also need to think about cemetery guardians. Pretty much every cemetery I have ever been to, with two exceptions, of very, very old, kind of reclaimed by nature cemeteries, there will be a cemetery guardian of some kind. It's going to be a metaphysical entity that is basically the head bitch in charge. That might be a spirit who is buried and resides in that cemetery. It might be some other type of metaphysical entity, gatekeepers. Sometimes they are fae. Sometimes, depending on your tradition and who works the cemetery and who's interred in the cemetery, it might be one of the big guardians like Baron Cemetery. There might be varying potencies of guardian. And anytime you enter a cemetery with intent, I don't mean to just walk around, take a look at things, take pictures, be a tourist. That's fine. Anybody can do that. It's cool. But if you're entering a cemetery with intent, you're going to communicate with spirits, you're going to work with spirits, you're going to do a working of some kind. You must ask permission of the cemetery guardian first. And you must receive a positive answer. You would be amazed at the number of times someone's like, I went and I made an offering to the guardian, and so why can't I do the thing? Well, did they accept your offering? I don't know. If you cannot tell whether or not a guardian of a location has given you permission or not, what are you even doing? You have practice to do before you start this. You need to develop the discernment to be able to tell. Thankfully, it's very, very easy most of the time. So When you enter the cemetery, the first thing you do is greet the guardian and ask permission to do a working. Oftentimes there's going to be a specific space that they're going to want you to do that. You might not know it first, and that's totally okay. When in doubt, just do it in the most discreet location you can that is nearest the gate. When I go to Lakeview, I know several practitioners that also work that cemetery, and we actually will all do our guardian offerings in different locations because that's how we've been directed to do things. I actually work with a different spirit than one of my best friends. Why? I don't know. They're the ones that have talked to each of us. I don't know what they talk about when, we're not there. But we have different faces for the guardian of that same cemetery. Personal gnosis is a thing. Talked about that in the previous lesson. If you haven't watched that one, watch that one. Lesson 9 is metaphysical entities. So yeah, you greet your guardian, you make them an offering, ask permission. So, for example, when I enter Lakeview, there's a tree that is kind of just inside the gates where I will go, and I will usually pour out some water. Sometimes I'll give pennies. Sometimes I'll give bird seed. Sometimes I'll have my peanuts for the crows. But that's where I will go and say, here's my intention. I'm going to go to these plots. I'm going to do these workings. Or I've just come for a maintenance, friendly chit-chat, like coming over for tea. Or, whatever my specific purpose for the visit is. I'll make my offering and say, hey, is that cool? It does not have to be some big, formal, iambic pentameter, perfect rhyming couplet. You can literally say, hey, guardian, I'm here to do a thing. Is that cool? Let me know. And for me, when I enter a cemetery, it will almost feel like everything is sort of muted until I receive permission from the guardian. And then suddenly I will be able to feel all of the different energies much, much more strongly, and I'll be able to connect to them. If I don't get permission, it's almost like you have cotton wool in your ears, and things just feel further away. I think a lot of the reason people feel uncomfortable in cemeteries a lot of the time is they are doing things they don't have permission to do, and so the guardian is less than friendly and makes them feel weird. If the guardian says no, you'll usually be able to tell. You might get swooped by a crow. Might get a sudden gust of wind blowing you back towards the gate. You might feel cold. The weather might turn. It's usually not that subtle. And 98 times out of 100, it's going to be yes if you're being respectful. In the hundreds of cemeteries that I've been to, because that's kind of what I do, all over the country, all over the world, I have only had a few cemeteries say no to me, particularly because I specialize in cemetery work. But there are a few specific cemeteries that are utterly infested with mistletoe in southern Oregon that want nothing to do with me. And I respect that. I have other things I can do. Places that don't feel all weird and creepy. I'm very at home in cemeteries. If I'm creeped out, something weird is going on. It's just not for me. It's okay. So yeah, the guardian's word is pretty much law in terms of who's allowed to practice in their cemetery. If you go to a cemetery, you ask permission, you feel like you gotta know, you need to respect that and back off. Keep in mind, just because you get a no once does not necessarily mean you can never ever try again. You can continue to go and ask, be respectful. If you get 3 no's in a row, maybe back off for a while. Don't be annoying and obnoxious about that kind of thing. But for the most part, you're going to be fine. Be respectful. If they say no, do something else. As I've said over and over and over again, you're trying to get from point A to point B. You do not need to take this very specific path. You can take this one over here or that one over there. There's lots and lots of ways of accomplishing your goals. You don't necessarily have to piss off a metaphysical entity. Why make your own life more difficult? So, say you've gotten to your cemetery, you've asked for permission. Guardian says, sure, you seem cool. Don't be a dick, and everything will be fine. Then you get to actually go inside, start your working, which is great. So, when you are entering a cemetery with the intention of doing magical practice, ask permission, make some kind of offering. You know, you don't always have to make offerings when you're doing magic. In cemeteries, you really always want to make some kind of offering. One of the biggest risks of working in a cemetery is you are entering into liminal space. You are entering into a place where the energy of the dead and of death can attach itself to you. It is very, very important that whatever you do in a cemetery, you leave the cemetery with an energetic balance. You don't want to owe them something. You don't want them to owe you something. Because when you leave, you want to leave with a clean slate. That is why I really recommend, no matter how many times you go to a cemetery, if you're going to do a working, always make an offering of some kind. Like I said, it can just be a glass of water. It can be a little bit of birdseed. I've done it with half a blueberry muffin from Starbucks. You know, it doesn't have to be some big ooky spooky like you would see in some massive altar in a Hammer horror movie. It can literally be half of your Snickers. It's fine. I've definitely poured out half a latte on a number of occasions. But I live in Seattle. It seems appropriate. So yeah. So always make sure you have an energetic balance when you go into a cemetery. Make your offering, ask permission. When it is accepted, and only if accepted, do you proceed. Most of the time, if you're going to go into a cemetery to do a working, you're either there for a social call to maintain your relationships with said metaphysical entities that may reside there, which we talked about a bit in Lesson 9, or you're going to work a specific grave. There are other options, and we'll talk about those in a minute, but most of the time, you're going to go into a working with a specific spirit at a specific grave. The reason spirit work is so potent in a cemetery is that someone's grave is their doorbell, essentially. When you go and contact someone in their grave, it's the direct line to that spirit. You know, if you're at home, if you're out and about in the world, in a place that is not connected to that person, it's kind of a circuitous route. It takes a little bit of extra energy to connect, to get the results you want. When you're in a cemetery, they're there. They're hearing you, kind of whether they want to or not. That's part of why it's so important to be respectful and to always ask permission. Because if you're at someone's grave, they don't really have the option of completely ignoring you. They're going to hear what you have to say. They have the choice to respond or not, but they are going to know that you did this. So when you go to the grave, you get to repeat the process you had with the guardian. You get to go, say hi. You know, maybe this is a spirit you know, maybe it isn't. If it's not, you need to initiate your contact the way you would with any other entity. Say, hi, so-and-so, I'm here to try to do X. Here is an offering. Are you cool with helping me out with that? If they say yes, great, proceed. If they say no, thank them for their time and move on. Keep in mind, you know, just as we talked about with the metaphysical entities lesson, really, if you haven't watched that one, just pause this, go back, watch that one. It will really help you out. With any spirit entity, If you can, you want your offering to be specifically what they want to receive. That's the difference between making an offering and a sacrifice. An offering is you're giving the spirit something they want. A sacrifice is giving up something that costs you, whether the spirit really wants it or not. The value is in your not having it. You may have noticed I don't talk about sacrifice a lot because I don't do it a whole heck of a lot. Lots of offerings because I'd rather give a spirit what they want rather than what I wish I didn't have to give up. Seems reasonable. So, for example, I talked about the gal that only wants whiskey. I give her whiskey. In a pinch, I'm also allowed to give her gin. She doesn't particularly like tequila, but she'll accept it in a pinch. I have another gal that really specifically wants English breakfast tea. If you are ever working with, say, the spirit of a Native American, please do not give them water. Tobacco is great if you've got it. Water, fantastic. Don't give them alcohol. Do not make an offering to someone who's a victim of genocide with one of the tools of their own oppression. That's bad form. Be respectful. Be aware. Don't be a dick. Unless you are able to freely engage in spirit communication, if you have mediumship abilities, you're probably going to want some type of divination tool to communicate with said spirit in their grave. I said pendulums are pretty good for this kind of thing because a lot of times you're asking yes/no kind of stuff. Pendulums are great. I do almost all of my spirit communication either just mediumistically or via tarot because those are the things I'm good at. Whatever divination method you're comfortable with, that's what you should have with you to help facilitate the communication. I know a gal who does everything via like automatic writing. She'll just write things and then have no idea. But it will be the spirit communicating. Super effective for her. I don't do automatic writing. So, only you know what your abilities are. Utilize them. The kinds of things you can do at this point. Things like energy exchanges. I will often, if I'm, say I'm doing a spell to... I'm working with someone who was a business person in life, and I'm helping... Blah, blah. I'm doing a spell to ace a job interview. I might ask that spirit to empower a pendant or a watch or cufflinks or something that I'm going to wear to the interview to imbue me with the professional spirit. Hire me. I'm great. Kind of energy. You can do energy exchanges. You can collect dirt from the grave for future use with permission. You can ask for advice or favors in terms of divination or things that the spirit might go and do for you on your behalf. All the things we talked about in the Metaphysical Entities lesson. A ghost, a spirit, is a metaphysical entity. They do the same stuff. Other things you can do. Actually, before we move on, when you finish whatever you're working on the grave is, say thank you. You've already made your offering, so you're good there, but say thank you. Say goodbye. If you expect to be back, let them know that you'll probably be back in such and such kind of interval. If not, you can be hey, thank you for your help. I don't know if I will return, but I will always fondly remember your help. Be polite. Always be polite to the metaphysical, because you just never know. Better to have positive relationships. So other things you can do in cemeteries. Number one is gathering spell components. I do a lot of things where pine cones or gravel or, windfall tree branches, detritus from shrubbery, that sort of thing. I will collect from cemeteries. I have a giant pile of crow feathers from Lakeview Cemetery. It's massive. It's great. Um, but you can get spell components in that way. It's pretty cool. You can also do things like charging a spell component. You can take a thing, put it somewhere discreet in a cemetery, let it sit there for a little while, come back and retrieve it, and it's all charged up with cemetery. Keep in mind, if you're leaving an object in a cemetery, maintenance people, animals, teenagers, other people come through these areas, and that object might not be there when you go back for it, depending on where you've left it. So this is not the place to put like heirloom jewelry. If you need to charge heirloom jewelry, you're going to collect your cemetery dirt, you're going to bring it to your house. Then you're going to put the jewelry in the cemetery dirt, and you're charging it that way. Be prudent, use common sense. Another thing that is amazing to do in cemeteries is any type of change or transitional working. Say you've just ended a relationship, and you've just done a cord cutting ritual to sever your energetic ties between you and your past partner. You can then bury that cord in a cemetery. And that is literally killing the relationship. No more link. No more energy for you. It's very, very final. Do not do this with like an ex-spouse where you share custody of a kid, because it's going to make any dealing with them at all very, very challenging. It's someone you never have to see again, or you wish to never, ever see again. That's the thing you can do. If you are, going through a phase change in your life, going from being a student to a professional, maybe you're going from a parent to an empty nester, some kind of big life change, or you're ready to make some kind of big paradigm shift, life change, you can make a little representation of your past and leave it in a cemetery. Now, the thing to be aware of is you want to make sure that whatever it is that's representing your past, make it biodegradable. This is where something like a corn dolly is pretty great, because it's all natural and will get eaten by things that live in cemetery, like rodents. If you are going to leave something in the cemetery that might be rodent attractant, be aware that rats are a problem in a lot of places, and you don't want to attract them. So maybe instead go for something like a single sheet of, recycled paper that will biodegrade real quick if you hide it in a bush. Be mindful of what you're doing to your physical environment. Don't poison things, don't salt the earth, don't attract rodents where they shouldn't be. Don't attract things like coyotes or bears either, depending on where you live. Use your common sense and good judgment. Know your surroundings, act accordingly. Yeah. Other things, Underworld Journaling. At Lakeview, there's this amazing, amazing plot with these stunning camperdown elms. If you've never seen a camperdown elm, I highly recommend you do a Google image search, like right now. Camperdown elm. They look like they're upside down. Like their branches look like a root system. And if you, like in the spring and summer when they're covered in leaves, you don't necessarily know unless you like stand at the trunk and like look up into them. But in the winter, it's just, it's very Tim Burton-esque. They're amazing. And they are actually fantastic mediums for journeying to the underworld. If you need to speak to someone, if you need to do any type of journeying, you can often sit on a grave, with permission, of course, or at a tree in a cemetery, and do your journey work. Caveats, of course, being make sure that this is a physically safe activity for you to do. Not all cemeteries are in the greatest of neighborhoods. Mostly they're pretty quiet, but some are not. Use your good judgment. Don't be stupid. Um, if you are in a location where you're going to do some journey work and you're not real confident, have backup. Have someone that can pull you back to anchor you to this reality so you don't mess yourself up. Um, perhaps wait until you're a little bit better at things. Make sure you can do your journey work safely in your own house, in a nice sacred circle, before you go and try to do it in a cemetery. Much more likely to get lost that way. General spirit communication. As I've said, cemeteries are liminal spaces. Communication is just easier, even if the spirit you're trying to contact does not physically reside in that cemetery. Obviously, if they do reside there, you should just go to their grave and do your communications there. But any spirit, particularly, a human departed soul spirit, very, very easy to contact in a cemetery compared to a lot of other places. Workings for letting go. As I said, earlier, cord cuttings are a great example of this. But anytime you have something to release, maybe you just need to release a bunch of anger, frustration, or something, any type of negative emotion that just needs to be grounded. Cemeteries are really good at grounding energy. Once again, make sure you've got the guardian's permission before you release a bunch of negative energy in their cemetery. They won't like it if you don't ask permission, because they've got to deal with it. But cemeteries are generally very, very efficient at grounding unwanted energies. The other thing that's really great in cemeteries is Bane Magic, which we'll talk about more in the next lesson. But if you want to hex somebody, a cemetery is a great place to do it. So yeah, lots of things you can do in cemeteries. Now, when you are ready to leave the cemetery, always thank any spirits that have helped you. As you do your workings, you say thank you. And then as you leave the cemetery, you do a general, hey everybody, thanks for letting me come. Hey guardian, thanks for letting me do my thing. Really appreciate it. And then you want to leave the cemetery and then ground and center. The most important thing when you leave a cemetery is to make sure you're not bringing anything with you that you did not intend to bring with you. That means no extra passengers, no lingering death energies, no unwanted cords or attachments. Way back in lesson 2, we talked about metaphysical hygiene. We talked about energy checks. This is where you do your energy check. Is there a dark spot? Is there a cold spot? Perhaps time to do some extra grounding and centering, cleansing. If you're not sure, you feel a little off kilter, very, very common to take a few grains of salt, put it under your tongue and let it dissolve. Salt is an incredibly grounding thing, and it will just physically help to realign you. And then, once you're sure you don't have anything with you that doesn't belong, go do something fun. Go do something light, something nourishing, something rejuvenating, something full of life, something you enjoy. Go dancing, go sing, go to the beach, do something that enlivens you, whatever that looks like for you. Maybe it's going to the goth club and dancing to some V&V Nation. Whatever. Do something that brings you joy and life, because you've just spent some time dwelling in death. Balance is critical to your well-being. So that's pretty much cemetery work in a nutshell. Your post-lesson tasks, should you choose to do them, please do them. Do some research on a local graveyard or cemetery and pick one to visit. Now, at the time of filming this, it is September of 2021. COVID-19 is still a thing. The Delta variant is very much a thing. Cemeteries are places you can be outdoors and more than 6 feet away from other people. This is a thing you can do quite safely, regardless of what's going on in your neck of the woods. So do your prep work and actually go. Take a walk through a cemetery. Introduce yourself to the guardian. See if any of the graves there might want to, want to work with you. Be willing to start beginning to cultivate a relationship. Make your offerings. But don't do any workings. The first time you go, just say hi, make introductions, make your offerings, say thanks, head home. Cleanse yourself afterwards. How do you feel? Some people absolutely love cemetery work, and they do it all the time. Some people do not. Some people are completely freaked out or energetically incompatible with doing cemetery work. And the only way to know is to go and walk the cemetery and see how you feel afterwards. Make your choice based on the evidence. If it feels great, do it again. If it doesn't feel great, maybe don't do it again. Maybe wait a year until you've solidified your practices or grown or some other thing happens. Give it another try. Don't feel like you have to do this to be a witch. I know plenty of practitioners that do not do cemetery work. That's fine. It is not for everybody. But if it is something you want to do, this is how you can do it safely, sanely, and effectively. It's pretty cool stuff. I spend a lot of time in cemeteries. I visit them any place that I travel. And I always very politely introduce myself before I do anything else. Worst case scenario, maybe you learn some history. Best case scenario, you gain some allies. It's pretty cool stuff. So yeah, that is cemetery work for you. As always, if you have any questions, you can email me. My email is down at the bottom of the description. Have a fantastic day. Bye.